Hey guys, okay, so I'm going to change up the videos today to have something a little different. So, I think this is a question that came up, I don't know, in my interest in the hobby over the years in radio. How much difference does sideband have than AM? Like, how much better can you hear a station? How much more power, let's say, do you need to have an equivalent communication on AM versus sideband? How many dB improvement is sideband? How much better can you talk, etc., etc. So I want to cover a couple things, and I'll give you the number in dB that I come up with, and it's based on two main things, which I'll cover. It's thermal noise power, or the noise floor, as it's proportional to the RF bandwidth of your receiver. As you narrow the uh, receiver's bandwidth, the RF bandwidth, the window, if you will, the filter, your receiver sensitivity improves because the noise that's coming in is reduced. Um, the other thing is power density, or where the power is focused. So there's those two main factors. This is not taking into consideration like interference or adjacent channel noise, stuff like that, other stations on the same frequency, kind of stuff like that. Just simply those two main things. Like for example, when you hear, especially in ham radio, you always hear you don't need a lot of power. I was able to talk around the world on 100 watts and a wire. Everybody says 100 watts and a wire. Well, how much power would you need to do the same thing on AM to have basically the same ability, right? Okay, so here we go. So the first thing is thermal noise floor. So I found this everythingrf.com has this thermal noise power calculator. So what is that? Thermal noise is the noise that is the result of thermal agitation of electrons. The thermal noise power depends on the bandwidth and the temperature of the surroundings. Okay, so here's temperature. 20C is like room temperature, but it has a small effect. But generally speaking, if it's really cold versus hot, it does matter a little bit. But for the most part, it's generally the same. It's only like a half a dB difference when it's like, say, very cold versus hot. Okay, so the main thing is the bandwidth. Okay, so we'll go here and you calculate the noise power. This is in dBm. It's negative, and if you're not too familiar with what dBm is, it's dB, the M means milliwatts, so the reference point is 1 milliwatt. For a received signal, 0 dBm or 1 milliwatt of power into your receiver is actually a lot. That's like a really strong signal. So this is 136 dB below that, and that's why it's minus 136. So 6 kilohertz here, I'm representing AM. Typical filter for AM is 6 kilohertz. So let's go to sideband, okay? Let's go to sideband. It's about 2.4 typically, right? 2.4 kilohertz. So notice it's minus 136. Now it's 140. Okay, so that's a even weaker, or even there's less noise with a narrower filter, or 2.4 kilohertz. So we got about a 4 dB improvement in the noise floor being lower, being narrowing the channel down to 2.4 kilohertz, the width. So we've just gained 4 dB reduction in noise. So that's the first number we're looking at, 4 dB. The other is, and I found this radiohobbyist.org has an interesting article. They got one thing wrong, but everything else looks good. They're talking about how the power is concentrated onto one sideband versus a carrier and two sidebands. Basically, a net effect of like a fourfold um, uh, improvement by going to a single sideband, single carrier. It's a 4x here, 4 times the equivalent to to 12 dB. The problem is they're talking about they got one thing wrong. Power is actually it's 3 dB for double. It's 6 dB for 4x, right? 6 dB. So it's not 12. That's when you're talking about 12 dB or 4x, that's talking about voltage. So we're talking about power. It's not 2S units. So it's 6 dB because it's 4 times the power focused on a single carrier. Okay, so 4x the power, that's 6 dB. So my conclusion is it's about 10 dB improvement SNR for running on sideband. Okay, so that's kind of the answer to the original question. It's 10 dB. 10 dB is about 2S units, a little less than that. So yeah, you'd have to run about 10 times the power on AM to have the same kind of communications as you would with sideband. So if you're running 100 watts on sideband, you'd have to run about 1,000 watts on AM to have the same, let's say, good communications because of these two things. So here's another thing to look at too. I thought would be interesting to bring up is the S meter. Okay, so you're talking about the S meter. So in dBm, minus 121 dBm. Remember going back here, the thermal noise floor. So 121, 19. Okay, now a receiver, that's the thermal noise floor of just natural radiation in the atmosphere. You can't, or in the universe, you can't get rid of this. It's always there. There's always electrons radiating this on all frequencies pretty much equally. It's just noise. So that you see there's a 19 dB difference, right? For S1 signal, you're 19 dB above the noise floor. But here's the thing, you can't, it's not perfectly like, say, the noise floor. There's a couple dB of losses in the circuitry, so you usually subtract maybe 3 more dB. So the receiver sensitivity, you'll see, is typically in the minus 130s for sideband for a typical HF radio. So let's just say 15 dB or so. So that's it, kind of explains here. 6 dB below that, minus 127 would be S0. And I'm sure you've had the experience where you've heard stations without the needle moving. You know, it's S0, but you still hear them because they're still coming in at 0.1 microvolt. There's still some voltage there. And if your noise floor is low enough, not from other noise, I'm talking about just clean noise, like clean, let's say you're out in the desert or somewhere where there's a lot of man-made noise that is on top of the thermal noise floor. Okay, then you should be able to still hear those stations even below S0. S0 is just a meter movement reading, right? It's not the actual. There's still microvolts of power hitting your antenna. So 0.1 would be like an S0. You could even go below that even. You can go into the minus 130s, and if you really have a good ear, you could still make out what they're saying. So anyway, hopefully that answers some questions. I know I had this type of question when I first got into the hobby, and I was like, how much difference does it make? And hopefully this kind of gives you some understanding of this. I think in radio, one thing that could really help is understanding dBm, because it really puts things in perspective of how things can make either a big difference or even a small difference, actually. And a lot of times we'll learn, like with antennas, sometimes we think things make a big difference, don't make that much difference. Like a difference between one antenna and another having, let's say, 2 or 3 more dB gain. The difference in the receive side would just be 2 or 3 dB M on the other side. So if your signal was, say, a minus 60, well, you change antennas, you're going to be a minus, let's say, 57 or 58. So, a little bit stronger, but in the grand scope of things, it's kind of insignificant. Where it really matters for those types of scenarios is when you're really closer to the noise floor. So anyway, hope this helps. All right, you guys take care. See ya.